the same way that most devotees did, by buying a Back to Godhead on the street. I met the devotees in 1971. I had just emigrated to Australia from England, where I was born and brought up in England. And then in mid-May of 1971, I traveled for 1 month on a boat from England to Australia. And the first day that we landed in Sydney, then we went in the downtown area. The devotees were out there chanting, doing Hare Nam. And I had never heard of them or seen them before, but I was attracted, and I bought a Back to Godhead magazine. That was Krishna's arrangement for me, because at that point I was having some serious upheaval, if you like, in my life. I was trying to figure out what I was going to do with the rest of my life, what the purpose of it was, if there was any purpose. I'd had in England, just before leaving, I had a very brief out-of-body experience, and that kind of woke me up to some point, that I suddenly realized there was another level of reality that I'd never heard anything about or understood before, and that, you know, everything that I'd perceived as being real up until that point, you know, maybe there's some other aspects of reality that we didn't know about. So it basically made me start to ask questions about, you know, what the real business in life is. Of course, when you're only 20 years old, it's natural, you're just finishing up your school, you're thinking about, you know, what you're going to do with the rest of your life. So it's a good age, actually, because it makes you a bit more inquisitive. And I got that Back to Godhead. I spent the first 6 months in Australia, in the northwest. We went from Sydney to Perth, and Perth we went north. I was with two friends, and we spent 6 months in a mining camp, just earning money. And for me it was good, because it was, you know, quite an obscure place. It's not like being in a big city where there's so many things going on and so many things to, you know, attract your mind and senses. We were working 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. We would get one day a month free. And so, you know, there's nothing to do, of course. And that isolation helped me kind of clear my head a little bit. And I was, at that point, reading a lot of, I guess you would say, esoteric books, because of this out-of-body experience that I'd had. I started reading books about what they call astral travel. There was one popular author at that time, his name was Lobsang Rampa. He wrote some book, The Third Eye, and like that. So I was reading that kind of stuff. I was reading a lot of science fiction, and every now and again I would take out the Back to Godhead and try and read some of that. When I first got the Back to Godhead, I couldn't make any sense of it at all. You know, when we landed in Sydney, we'd met some other guys on the boat. So there was a group of about 10 or 12 of us. We all went together into the city just to check out Sydney and, you know, see what Australia was going to be like. We bought this. I was the only one that bought the magazine. The devotees were on a street corner, and when the red lights were there, everybody was waiting at the lights. And then a few of the devotees had stacks of Back to Godheads, and they were selling them, offering them to the people waiting at the lights. So I bought one, but none of the other group bought one. So then when we got back to the hostel where we were staying, I think the first week or 2 weeks, I think the first 1 week, we got a free hostel provided by the government. Then from there you had to find your own place to stay and you had to get a job. So when we got back to the hostel, we were looking at this Back to Godhead, and the cover picture was the Rasa Leela. It was, the magazine number was number 37. So it had a picture of the Rasa Leela on the front. And we had no clue whatsoever what it represented, what it was about. We were looking, there's all these small blue men dancing, and there's some thing floating in the air, dropping flowers, and so we couldn't figure it out. None of us had had any contact, I think, with India or with spiritual, anything spiritual, and we certainly hadn't heard of Krishna. So the closest we got at that point to figuring it out, one of the fellas that we met on the boat, his name was Bill, he was from Scotland. So he looked and he said, I think that the blue fellas, I think they're spirits. That's Krishna. But that was as close as we could get. And then when I opened up the magazine, because of lots of Sanskrit names, and the whole subject matter was completely different from anything I'd ever read before. So when I opened it up, there was a pencil drawing of Narada Muni, and I remember thinking, who's this woman? And when I tried to read the magazine, it was almost impenetrable. I just was so completely, unfamiliar with the whole content and style and everything. But at the same time, I could feel a kind of, it was almost like the magazine was vibrating. There was something very compelling about it. And I didn't throw it away. I packed it very carefully in my suitcase, and I actually had the thought that I'll keep this until I'm ready for it. So I knew there was something in there that was worthwhile reading. I had no idea what, but I was not quite ready for it. So then after that we went north to the mining camps, and over 6 months periodically I would take this BTG out and I'd read it, and I was able to start gradually, penetrating what was being said there. So by the end of the 6 months, I got to a point where I'd realized that my material life was finished. I couldn't relate to, the ordinary course of working in the world, and, So I felt that the only place where I might be able to get some information, and I had some questions, about, well, mainly my main question was about whether there was a God or not. And in my teenage life, I was an atheist. Then in my late teens, around 19 or so, I kind of changed my stance a bit, and I had to admit that there's no way you can prove whether God exists or not. So you can't really honestly say that you're an atheist, because an atheist denies that there's an existence of any kind of God. But how can you say? You can't prove that. So I thought it was more reasonable to be an agnostic, where you neither accept or reject. But it doesn't answer the question. Then after 6 months of being up in the north, gradually my thinking was kind of clarifying a little bit. And I had this realization that we're not part of the material world. I sometimes had a kind of a mental image in myself where I would be outside the universe looking in. And the universe was, like an enclosed space. I was outside of it. he could look in and see that there was no such thing as time, past, present, and future. Everything was going on at the same time. And that everybody was kind of trapped, just running here and there without any real purpose. So I developed this detachment from the material world. And at the same time, though, although I've had this, image of looking inside the material world from the outside, I couldn't look behind me and see what was there. Because if the universe is an enclosed space, it has to be enclosed within something else. So I could, at least figuratively, I could look inside the universe and see that it was all purposeless. But at the same time, I couldn't see where I was, and I couldn't see what was behind me. So that was a big puzzle. And then I would, now and again, this question would come, well, what is God? And I had no answers for that. And it was very annoying, because I wasn't a religious person. I hadn't been since I was about 10 years old. And, to have this question of God coming back in, it wasn't very welcome. In some respects, it was a big puzzle. But it was persistent, and I knew that I hadn't found out the answer, to what life is and what its purpose is. I knew I wouldn't find the answer to that unless I could answer that question as to whether there was a God. So I decided around Christmas time of 1971 to leave my friends at the mining camp. They wanted to stay for a few months more and earn more money. And I decided I had to go back to Sydney and find these people that I'd bought this magazine from and see if I could get, some further answers. Because the answers were already there in the Back to Godhead that I had, but I didn't click on it at that point. Anyway, so I had this question. And there was one guy that we met at the mining camps. He was a young, passionate New Zealander, long hair, a bit like a hippie kind of. And he was into mental speculation. So he told me about a book. I think it's called The First and Last Freedom by J. Krishnamurti. Krishnamurti at that time was quite popular amongst the intellectuals and, on the guru circuit. And this fellow had read one of his books. In that book, Krishnamurti was saying that nobody is your guru, I'm not your guru, you're your own guru. And when you finish reading this book, you should throw it away, because you should realize that you don't have to learn anything from anybody else. You are your own guru, so you don't need me and you don't need this book. So he had written 13 books or something to tell everybody not to read them. And everybody was thinking, oh, this is amazing stuff. Anyway, so this fellow, he'd read this book and he was, oh, this is fantastic. This guy says that you be your own guru. You don't have to listen to anybody else. So get this book. So all right. So when I left the mining camp and I arrived in Perth for a few days on a transit, I went to the bookstore and I bought that book. And when I opened it up, I went to the table of contents, and I was particularly looking to see if he said anything about God. Is there a God? And in fact, in the 3rd chapter, it was supposed to answer that question. So I skipped the rest of the book. I went straight to that particular chapter. Is there a God? And then his opening paragraph was that people often ask me if there is a God. And I always tell them that if you think that there is a God, then there's a God. And if you don't think that there's a God, then there's no God. And I thought, this is just nonsense. I mean, I didn't know anything myself, but I knew enough to realize that if there is a God, then he exists objectively. It's not a question of whether you believe it or not. He's either there or is not. And I didn't even know whether to, say he, it, whatever, God. Is there a God? So I knew if there is a God, then he exists whether I believe it or not. So immediately I followed Krishnamurti's advice and I threw the book away. I thought, this guy doesn't know anything. And then the following week, I had left Perth and I arrived in Melbourne. And I was in an 8-hour transit and on the way to Sydney. And so just to kill some time, I went for a walk around the Melbourne city centre. And just near the main railway station, there's actually 2 blocks away, there's the city square. And as I came towards the city square, I heard, ching, 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 ching. I heard the devotees, and I recognized this is the same sound that I'd heard in Sydney months before. So I was quite excited, and the devotees were there. They had a big crowd around them, and they were selling magazines and books. Well, actually just magazines. In those days there were no books, at least in Australia. So I went up to one of the devotees, his name was Upananda, and I asked him, do you have anything there that tells you what God is? So of course he got very excited, and I explained to him that actually I'm on the way to Sydney to find your temple there and meet the devotees there. So he said, well, you don't need to go to Sydney, you could stay right here in Melbourne, we've got a temple here. I had it in my mind, no, I've got to go to Sydney. So anyway, I looked and saw what magazines he had. He had another 3 editions of Back to Godhead, so I bought those. And then I asked him, do you have anything that tells you what God is? So he immediately opened up one of the magazines. To his credit, he'd read all the magazines, so he knew what was in them. And he went straight to one paragraph, which was from Srila Prabhupada's lecture. So in BTG, that was the standard. The opening lecture is always Prabhupada, and then articles by the devotees. So he went straight to Prabhupada's article, and he read out this paragraph which gave a description of God. And so I listened, and I put my finger in the page so that I wouldn't lose it. And then I thought, now I'll take this and I'll go and sit by the riverbank whilst I'm waiting for my train, and I'll read it more seriously. So off I went. Then in Melbourne, the river goes right through the city centre. So I went off to the riverbank, I sat down, and then I opened up this particular page and read the description. So Prabhupada was giving a brief description of God. So he said, God is omniscient, God is omnipresent, God is omnipotent, and God is a person, and his name is Krishna. So as I started to read it, this mental image that I'd had before, being outside the universe and looking in, I kind of, it came to mind again. And when I read the description, God is omniscient, means that he knows everything, I immediately had a realization what that meant. That if you're outside the universe and looking in, you can know everything that's going on from that vantage point. So it was like a light bulb going off in my head that God is omniscient, and then God is omnipresent, he's everywhere at once. Same thing, another light bulb went off. And then God is omnipotent, that he's all-powerful and everything is under his control. That was another light bulb that went off. Each one, I got this kind of image there, and I understood at least in principle what that meant, to be omniscient, to be omnipotent, to be, omnipresent. And then the key thing was that the next line, Prabhupada said, and God is a person. And as soon as I read that, that was it. It was like about 1,000 light bulbs going off in my head. God is a person. And I thought, of course, he has to be. If he knows everything and he's in control of everything and he's everywhere, then he must be a person. And then when Prabhupada said, and his name is Krishna, I thought, wow, he's actually got a name as well. So I never thought about God having a name before. So that was it for me. That was my, what the Christians call an epiphany. It means a moment when you have such a powerful realization that it changes your whole life. So that was my moment, moment of epiphany, that I suddenly realized that God actually exists. And immediately that I had that realization, that that was the last bit of information that I needed, that God is a person. Then I realized that now if I accept this as true, then I'm going to have to surrender to this, whatever it is. I had no idea. I'd never been to a temple. I had no idea how the devotees lived. I'd only ever met them, just for 5 minutes. And I understood what the implication was, that if I accept that God exists and he knows everything about me, and there's nowhere where I can go where I can get away from him, and he's in complete control of everything, so there's nothing I can do, to be independent. I realized the implication of that was that then you have to surrender. There's no other choice. If you're actually being honest with yourself, then you have to accept that this is it. So that, I made up my mind on the spot. When I get to Sydney and I find this temple, I'm going to have to join. So I was a bit apprehensive. I had no idea what I was getting into, but I knew that I had to do it. And the point being is that the week before, I'd read this book by this rascal, that if you believe there's a God, there's a God. If you don't believe there's a God, there's no God. Just word jugglery. All mental concoction and nonsense. And then the next week I get this magazine from Srila Prabhupada, and he's very clear. God is omniscient, omnipresent, omnipotent, and he's a person, and his name is Krishna. How clearer can you get? It was just a statement of fact. And that, had a very, very powerful impact on my consciousness, that here's a person who actually knows what he's talking about. He's very clear, about what life is and what it's for. And so that was it. I just, I knew if I'm going to be honest now, then I'm going to have to surrender and pursue this path. So that was it. That was my introduction. And I was lucky, actually, because when I went to Sydney, it took me 2 or 3 days to find the devotees. I'd rented a house in one of the inner city suburbs. And then I set out every day to go into the city, and I was wandering around the streets looking for the devotees because I didn't know where they were. The address that was given in the BTG was not correct. They'd already moved. And after 3 or 4 days, I suddenly bumped into them. They were out doing Harinam, and then they told me where their temple was, and it turned out to be not very far away from where I was living. So then I went round to the temple one evening, and it was just right on the time of the evening arati. There was just 3 or 4 devotees there, not many. And then afterwards I spoke with one of the devotees. He sold me a Bhagavad Gita. Then I started reading the Bhagavad Gita. And I knew at some point I'm going to have to join the temple. But I needed a little bit of time to get my mind adjusted to the fact that I was now going to give up everything that I'd ever known, give up my friends, give up, the whole social structure that I've been brought up in, and join this temple. So it took me a few weeks to get my head around it. So it wasn't until mid-February, about 3 or 4 weeks after I had this realization, then I finally started going to the temple every day. for about 1 week, and then I moved in. And then I was very fortunate that 6 weeks later, on April the 1st, Prabhupada came for his second visit to Australia. So very early on, I got to meet Srila Prabhupada personally and, hear what he had to say. And of course, there was a lot of apprehension. In meeting Srila Prabhupada, because we'd literally given up our entire lives just on the basis of a few words that we'd read of Prabhupada's in his Back to Godhead magazine, or maybe other books. And people don't normally do that. You just walk away from everything, renounce everything, just to follow somebody that you've never met, just on the basis of, reading a few things that they've said. So on the one hand, we were very excited that Prabhupada was coming so early. And on the other hand, there was this apprehension whether he would actually live up to, our expectation. And expectations, were quite high. As I say, you've literally given your whole life to this person. So it was a lot of apprehension there as well. And then when Prabhupada actually arrived, then I was very happy to discover that not only did he live up to my expectation, he by far exceeded it. Prabhupada was on a different plane of consciousness that, we had never met anybody like that before. And so, when we met him in person, it really, really made a tremendous impact on us. And I became very convinced, of course, we became very enthusiastic. And we were introduced to another aspect of Krishna consciousness that you won't find written about in the books. One of the devotees that was in Sydney at that time was Upendra Prabhu. He had been Prabhupada's personal servant in 1967 in San Francisco. And then, of course, later on in 1977, he was Prabhupada's personal servant in the last 6 or 8 months with Prabhupada leaving. So Upendra and one other devotee, Bali Madan, they were the first devotees to take Krishna consciousness to Australia. Bali Madan went there on his own, and then after 2 weeks, Upendra flew in to join him. And they started the movement there in Australia. So Upendra was still there in the Sydney temple when I joined at the beginning of '72. And he, would tell us all these stories about Srila Prabhupada from the early days. And that was really, prepping us, whetting our appetites, so to speak. And he told us then about this other state of consciousness, which was not exactly Krishna consciousness, but it's what he called Prabhupada consciousness. And he said, if you really want to make advancement, you have to become Prabhupada conscious. So, we're waiting to see whether we would experience Prabhupada consciousness when Prabhupada actually came. And after he'd been there for about, I think, he came for about 10 or 12 days. Most of the time he was in Sydney. He went down to Melbourne for 3 or 4 days. They had, I'm not sure whether he installed some deities there. He gave sannyas to one devotee that was there. And they had this program in the Melbourne Town Hall. And they put up this poster with this image of Srila Prabhupada from the side, like you see on the Back to Godhead. And it announced the arrival of the Jagat Guru, Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, and that he would be speaking at the Melbourne Town Hall, and something like a couple of thousand people came, which was huge in those days, to hear Prabhupada speak. At the end of it, they had a kirtan. About 1,000 people in the audience jumped up and started dancing and chanting, so it was tremendously successful. Anyway, so we had Prabhupada with us for about 10, 12 days. And we actually experienced that unique state of being Prabhupada conscious, at least for a brief period. That was all that we were thinking of from morning till night, that Prabhupada is here. Even if we weren't, because we saw him once a day giving his class in the evenings. He was lecturing. But in the daytime he was staying at some Grihasta couple at their house because there was no place at the temple, and that was a few miles away. So we only got to see him just with the classes. If you were really fortunate, you might get permission to go on one of the morning walks. So, but still, our whole state of consciousness was just focused completely and exclusively on Srila Prabhupada and his visit. So by the end of it, when Prabhupada left Sydney and went to New Zealand, then we had this real experience that we've been in this kind of a high state of consciousness for over a week or so whilst Prabhupada was there, and now suddenly he was gone. It's like there was this huge vacuum. Yeah, then we had to adjust and get back on with our normal state of activity. Anyway, so that in brief is how I first met Srila Prabhupada. And of course, here we are 43 years later, still going on. All right. Any other questions? For those of you that arrived a bit.
What are the challenges being that devotee height?
What are the challenges?
There's always a fear of when we go too close to very senior devotee.
Okay, so what are the challenges in personally serving the spiritual master? There's a lot. At least with Srila Prabhupada. Prabhupada was in the most elevated state of consciousness all the time. That was his natural state. For us, our natural state was, more or less in the mode of ignorance and passion, with a little glimpse of goodness sometimes. And so trying to stay, to be with Srila Prabhupada and travel with him, you had to be in the same, I wouldn't say exactly the same level of consciousness, but you had to be in the mood where you were, always receptive to Srila Prabhupada's level of consciousness, which is almost the same thing. So it was not an easy thing to stay 24 hours, 7 days a week, in direct contact with somebody who's in the most elevated state of consciousness that you've ever met. And for that reason, there were a good number of personal servants and secretaries. And generally they'd last, a few months. And then it would become very difficult to stay, tuned in to Prabhupada for that long. And they would go off and do some other kind of service. Out of all the servants, Srudakirti was the one that served Prabhupada the most, the longest. He had one stretch of 16 months, and then he had a couple of other stretches of 4 months each, so about 2 years he was with Prabhupada. I stayed with Prabhupada for 16 months in one stretch, and then I had about a month and a half in 77 when I was a GBC. So, just staying in a good state of consciousness, completely, you had to be in a state of more or less complete surrender, just to stay with Prabhupada and be with him and travel with him. So it was not, in that sense, easy. As I say, a lot of previous servants had found it difficult. For myself, I never felt any difficulty in being with Srila Prabhupada. It felt to me to be a very natural thing. I love to be with, Prabhupada in his room, on the walk, in the class, wherever, having conversations. So I guess in that sense, I wasn't too... Well, sometimes some devotees, they would get so overwhelmed and in awe of Srila Prabhupada as a person that, they couldn't function properly. Sabag Maharaj, some of you know Sabag Maharaj. So I think one time Prabhupada was in London and he needed somebody to massage him. And Sabag Maharaj is a bit, a nervous kind of disposition anyway. He's a very meek and gentle person. And Prabhupada, liked his massage to be very strong. It had to be, really a good workout. And he was asked to massage Prabhupada, and he was so nervous that he could hardly touch him. Yeah. So then obviously he missed his chance. If he'd have done it nicely, but he was very, very nervous, and that happened to a lot of devotees. Sometimes when you first met Prabhupada, you'd be in so much awe, and reverence, that you literally, your brain would shut down. I had an experience like that before I became Prabhupada's servant, where I mentioned this morning about this incident that I had in Vrindavan when there was a temple commander. So when I was called into Prabhupada's room to explain everything, there was just Prabhupada there and myself, and I was able to talk to him, and he told me, now you find this boy, bring him back, apologize, and bring him back to the temple. You've committed a big offense. So the next day I'd gone out to try to find where this fellow was staying, and I couldn't find him. And then I came back to the temple. I was feeling very depressed that Prabhupada had told me to do something and I've not been able to do it. Then another knock on the door. Prabhupada wants to see you. So I thought, now, I'm going to get it, because I'm going to have to go and tell him that I couldn't find this fellow and, rectify the offense. But when I went into Prabhupada's room, there was about 50 people in there. So it was the middle of the darshan. And Prabhupada, of course, was at his desk, and all these people were there. I walked in, he saw me, and he called me forward. So I was so nervous that when I came up to Prabhupada's desk, he started to say something to me, and I couldn't figure out what he was saying. It was like my ears just kind of blocked up, and nothing was computing. So the words were going in, but I couldn't register on it at all and focus. And I'm just looking at Prabhupada completely blank. And Prabhupada could see that I wasn't hearing what he was saying. So he stopped and he repeated himself. And when he repeated himself, I made a conscious effort to really try and focus on what he was saying and, hear what he wanted. And I couldn't. My brain just would not work. And not a single word made any sense. He was speaking English, but it just wasn't registering. And so then Prabhupada got a little bit frustrated, and he turned to one of the managers and he told him, now you tell him. When this fellow told me, I heard every single word. But when Prabhupada was speaking, I was in so much awe that it just wasn't registering at all. Anyway, I saw that happen to a number of devotees, that they would get so stunned by just being in Prabhupada's physical proximity and at least, having a personal exchange with him, that, their brains would stop working. So you couldn't be in too much awe and reverence, but at the same time, the relationship with the guru-disciple is, of course, one of awe and reverence. So you had to figure out how to maintain your awe and reverence and at the same time still be practical and do something. Yeah, and, serve Prabhupada in whatever ways that he wanted. So the other, issue, of course, is that you don't want to commit any offenses. That's the main thing. There's a purport where Prabhupada mentions that the personal servants of the deity and the spiritual master, they're in a situation, it's like when you get close to fire. If you handle it properly, you can get warmed up very nicely, and if you mishandle it, you can get burnt. So the personal servants of the deities and the spiritual master, they have a chance for making rapid advancement because of the close proximity that they're doing their service in. But at the same time, they also have the chance of committing a lot of offenses. So if one cannot remain there and do things properly, then it's better to stay away and keep some distance. That way then you won't commit any offenses. But if you're going to come in close proximity, then you have to be very, very careful. You can make rapid advancement, but you don't want to commit offenses. So one of the realizations that I had when I first joined Prabhupada's personal party, this was at the end of November in 1975 in Delhi, there were a couple of small things, mistakes that I made, not serious things, but they were there. And I realized that if I'm going to stay and serve Srila Prabhupada at close quarters, it's not going to be possible to avoid offenses. It's inevitable. I'm so untrained. At that time I was a bit less than 4 years in the movement. And I really didn't have much idea about what Krishna consciousness as a practice was. I mean, we learned some things, obviously. But Prabhupada's level of practice was on such a higher standard than ours. So I realized that if I was going to be with Prabhupada, I'm definitely going to make offenses. So what to do? Yeah, if I give up the service, I won't make the offenses, but then I don't get to do the service. If I want to do the service, then I'm bound to make offenses, so how am I going to deal with that? So I realized that the only protection that you have as a servant is to be very humble. Then if you make a mistake, if you're very humble, you admit it, you try to rectify it, then Prabhupada was happy with that. So even if you made some silly mistakes, if you showed some, intent or capability of rectifying it, and as long as you didn't make the same mistake again, then Prabhupada wouldn't say much. He would be okay with that. So it's like a protection that you have that humble attitude. But if you have some kind of ego and you make a mistake and you don't like to admit it, then you can't be trained. So that's a dangerous situation. So I realized my only protection against the inevitable offenses that I was going to make in serving Prabhupada was just to have this very humble attitude. And then, that would mean that you could make the necessary rectification or improvement in your service. And that's the principle, really, of doing any service for any senior or advanced devotee. You just have to be very humble. Everything that we do is based on that amanit vam adambit vam, pridelessness and humility. That way then I was able to stay with Srila Prabhupada for, a reasonable amount of time, because I had that realization and, saw the necessity of keeping myself in a humble state of mind at all times. When I got to the point when I left Prabhupada's party, that was in March of 1977. So that was after about 16 months with him. I had gotten to a point where I started to feel that I was getting a little bit inattentive. I'd made a few small errors in my service, which I shouldn't have done because there were things that I'd been doing, many times before. But I'd caused a little bit of inconvenience, on a couple of occasions to Srila Prabhupada. And it was really just due to my own inattention. And my conclusion was that I was getting a little bit stale in my activities and service. Things had become routine, and I was starting to take things a little bit for granted. A bit of that familiarity breeds contempt. I was very much aware of that. I was very afraid of getting into that kind of state of consciousness, and I could feel it coming on. And so on my own, I felt maybe I should take a break. Otherwise, if I continue as I am, I'm going to make some offenses, and that will damage my spiritual advancement. So I actually went to Srila Prabhupada and I told him that I'm feeling a little bit strained and I feel like I need a break. I said, I don't want to commit any offenses. And as soon as I said that, Prabhupada's eyes opened up. He said, very good. He was very happy that I was aware enough of my own state of consciousness, that I didn't want to just go on and then, make mistakes and commit offenses anymore. So you've got to be kind of self-aware. You have to be aware of what Prabhupada wanted, and you have to be aware of your own capability of doing it as well. So I think that protected me a lot of the time, from the inevitable mistakes that you do make when you're with somebody constantly 24 hours a day. One of my favorite examples, my favorite experiences, and what it was like to be with Srila Prabhupada. Sometimes people ask you that question. There's a story from when we left France in August of 1976, and we flew to Iran. In those days, the Shah of Iran was still in power, so Westerners, Americans could still go there, and we had a small temple with about 3 or 4 householder couples, 1 sannyasi, and a brahmachari. That was the whole Tehran Yatra. So Prabhupada went there for about 7 days. So when we arrived, it was late at night, and it was about 11 o'clock or so by the time that we got to the house where the devotees were staying. And then, of course, they were very excited. Prabhupada's come. It was a very small yatra, and it was a very kind of isolated place, of course. And so they stayed up with Prabhupada for about an hour or so. Nandarani was there. She cooked a little supper for him. So it was about 12 o'clock, or I think there were a couple of new Iranian Bhaktas that had joined. So Prabhupada met with them and preached to them. And we'd been traveling all day long. From early morning we traveled. And now it was late at night. It got to about 1 o'clock. Finally, Prabhupada sent everybody to take rest. And then he went into his room, and I gave him his evening massage, which was probably about 15 to 20 minutes, not long. And then Prabhupada got straight up and went straight into the room next to it where I set up his dictaphone and started his translation work. So virtually he didn't sleep. Yeah, but of course, I was not on the same level as Prabhupada. I had to sleep, I was wiped out. And that was one thing about being the servant, that when everybody else had finished for the day, the secretary, the cook, or whatever else, you had to stay up and massage Prabhupada. And then, finally you get to rest about 11 o'clock at night, then you had to get up at, 4:30, 5 o'clock the next morning. So it was a little bit tough. Anyway, in Iran, Prabhupada went straight into his Bhagavatam dictations, and I went next door. We had a buzzer system, so a long piece of wire with a button on one end and a bell on the other. I put the button in Prabhupada's room, and I had the bell, come through the window, and I had it right next to my head. So I was just falling asleep. It was about 1:30. I was just got in my sleeping bag. I started drifting away. All of a sudden, brrr, the bell goes. So I jumped up, went into Prabhupada's room, offered my obeisances, and Prabhupada's trying to do his dictations, but his dictaphone wasn't working properly. So he said, just fix it, because I had no idea how to fix electronic goods, but somehow or another I figured out there was a short, a missing connection somewhere, and I got it working again. So then I went back into my room, laid down, started to go to sleep. I'm just drifting off. Brrr. I jump up, run into Prabhupada's room, same thing, it's not working again. So again, I got it working. went back, laid down, got in my sleeping bag, just drifting off, and like that 5 times. As soon as I just laid down and started drifting away, the bell went and I had to jump up and run in Prabhupada's room. So finally I, laid down again after the 5 times. I'm just drifting away to sleep again and 6th time. So I jump up, I run into Prabhupada's room, offer my obeisances, I look up and Prabhupada's working away and there's nothing wrong. Yeah, he's translating and the dictaphone's working. And when I came in the door, he looked and he gave me a look like, "What are you doing here?" So he had not rung the bell, but I was so, in such a state of consciousness that as soon as I laid down, that 6th bell, that was me dreaming it. That was, so, that you had to be in that state of kind of consciousness. You couldn't complain, "Oh, not again," No, it was, "Oh, the bell's ringing, Prabhupada wants something." So you run in and, do it. So you had to be in that kind of consciousness if you wanted to stay with Prabhupada. That was, all right. So just be humble, that's the key. Then, because nobody can be perfect in their activities, you're always going to make mistakes, commit some kind of an offense, intentionally or unintentionally, whatever. But you have to be prepared for that. And the preparation for that is to always be in a very humble, open state of consciousness. Then you can correct things. Then the spiritual master, he forgives you immediately. But if you make a mistake and you don't clear it properly, if you don't clear the offense properly, it hangs over you and it will depress your spiritual advancement. There's other stories I can tell, but we don't have enough time. But for today, at least. Any other questions? One more question. All right, I'll tell you one more story. Usually the events that we remember the most are the ones where we were the most offensive. For some reason or another, those episodes always stick out in your mind more than anything else. The mistakes that you made or the offenses that you committed. We were in Vrindavan in 1976. Prabhupada came back there at the beginning of September. We stayed for 3 months. And Prabhupada had a room on the roof in Vrindavan. Who's been to Prabhupada's quarters in Vrindavan? Anybody? So you've seen. Yeah, Prabhupada's quarters in Vrindavan. So on the roof there's a room. So Prabhupada used to like to go up there after breakfast and again after lunch because it was nice and airy. And he would take rest there for an hour or so after he'd eaten. And then sometimes he would stay up there for a little while, meet with, maybe the managers or whatever, and then he would come down again. So when they first installed that room there's a veranda at the front, then there's the room, and then there's a veranda at the back. And to get to the back veranda, you have to go through the room. So through one side and then the other side. And initially, there was no buzzer system. So if Prabhupada was up on the roof, the servant had to stay there all the time that he was there, just in case he needed anything. So after the summer tour in 1976, and we came back after, we'd been to Australia and South Seas and America and Europe, and we came back. So when we arrived back in September, the devotees had installed a buzzer system upstairs. So there was a button on Prabhupada's desk upstairs, and it rang a bell downstairs. So it meant that the servant could be downstairs doing other services while Prabhupada was resting, and then if he rang the buzzer from upstairs, you would hear it and then run upstairs and see what he wanted. So this particular morning, Prabhupada went upstairs after breakfast. He went through the 2 doors of the room, either side, and onto the back veranda. And we had a mattress there, and he laid down in this nice, warm sunshine, November sun. It's very, kind of health-giving. And I thought, well, Prabhupada's going to rest for a while. And there was a couple of devotees that had just arrived from Australia. And they were my old friends. So I thought, I don't need to stay on the roof because Prabhupada's got the buzzer. And if he needs me, he'll just ring. So I'll go downstairs and I'll meet with these friends. So I left Prabhupada on the back veranda. I entered the room, I shut the screen door, and I bolted it on the inside. That means that Prabhupada was now locked on the back veranda. But I was thinking about going and seeing my friends. I wasn't really concentrating on what I was doing. So automatically, because Prabhupada had always trained us, switch off the fans, switch off the lights, close the doors. So I closed the screen door and bolted it, and as I was bolting it from the inside and locking him out, I was thinking, now if Prabhupada needs me, he'll just come in and press the button and ring the bell. Of course, he couldn't do that. So I went downstairs. After about an hour or so, hour and a half, 15 minutes, I was talking to my friends, and I was thinking, Prabhupada's really resting a long time today, And then there was this little thing in the back of my head, go upstairs. And I was ignoring it because, I was enjoying listening to the sound of my own voice, talking with my friends. So I was ignoring this intuition. It was super soul, get upstairs. And just when I was starting to think maybe I should go and see what's happening, then this German devotee that had been staying in the guest house, his name was Maharati, big guy. He'd been a butcher before he became a devotee. He told us actually when he was a butcher, the first thing every morning that they would do is they would kill a cow, they would capture the blood in a cup, and they would all drink a glass of fresh, hot blood every day. This was the, butchers. Anyway, somehow he became a devotee. So he had a room in the guest house that was overlooking the back of Prabhupada's quarters. You could see Prabhupada's garden, and he could see Prabhupada laying on the mattress on the roof. So he was enjoying that every morning. So this particular morning, just when I was starting to think, Prabhupada's been a long time this morning resting, then all of a sudden Maharati comes flying around the corner from the guest house, and he's in a complete panic, and he starts yelling, Hare, Sauri, Hare, Sauri. And as soon as I saw him, I knew it had happened. Then I clicked, and I realized I've locked Prabhupada on the back veranda. So he yelled, he came around, he said, Prabhupada's stuck on, locked on the back veranda. He's shouting and asking, to be let out. So I just ran. I ran up the back stairs, I ran into the room, and because normally when we came into Prabhupada's proximity, we would immediately offer our obeisances, and when Prabhupada left, you would also again offer your obeisances. But this time, when I ran into the room from the front side, the screen door was there on the back side, and Prabhupada was standing there waiting, and he's looking through the screen door. So I didn't even bother offering my obeisances. I just wanted to get the door open and free Prabhupada from the back veranda. So I slid the bolt open, and as I was doing that, Prabhupada's just on the other side of the screen door. He's looking at me, he said, you rascal. He said, I've been locked up here for an hour and a half. And that was it. I mean, it sounds funny now, but I tell you, I wasn't laughing at that point. So Prabhupada walked straight past me. I offered my obeisances and then followed him downstairs. Then when he got into his sitting room, he was shaking his head. He said, too much voracious eating and sleeping. He said, your brain is dull. So I was, trying to apologize. I'm really sorry, Srila Prabhupada. It was, a mistake. And so, anyway, Prabhupada let it go. After he chastised me, he didn't yell at me, but he just let it go. So then it was time for massage. So then we went out in the back garden. I gave Prabhupada his massage. Prabhupada was completely, it was over and done with. That was it. It wasn't. But for me, whilst I was massaging Prabhupada, I felt like I had this big black cloud hovering over my head and weighing me down. And I realized I have not cleared this offense. I mean, sometimes when you made a mistake, if you just apologized or you rectified it, then it was clear, you just went on. But this time, it was so offensive that I realized this reaction is still hovering over me. This offense is still hovering over me. I could feel it. And I was feeling very miserable. So then when Prabhupada went and took his bath, then he took his lunch, and then he went back upstairs again for the afternoon. So by that time, I decided what I should do. So I followed Prabhupada upstairs after lunch, and he had a rocking chair on the front veranda, and sometimes he would sit in that and relax before going to take rest. So as soon as Prabhupada sat down in his rocking chair, I came before him. I offered my full-length dandavats, and as humbly and as reticently as I could, I just told him, I said, Prabhupada, I'm really, really sorry. It was so stupid. I'll never ever do anything like that again. And so I just made the biggest effort that I could to be humble and apologize. And as soon as I said that, Prabhupada smiled. He gave a big grin. And that cloud just lifted. It just disappeared immediately. As soon as Prabhupada smiled, he accepted my apology. That offense was lifted. And I was completely relieved. And then it was back to normal. So, you have to be really careful when you're with the spiritual master. Sometimes he may not even indicate, his displeasure, maybe just briefly, and then, it's finished. But you had to be aware enough of your own state of consciousness to know whether you had cleared, the offense that you'd committed. So it's not just a question of the spiritual master not saying anything. It's a bit like Ambarish Maharaj. Yeah, he never took it that Devasa Muni is being offensive to me. But actually he was being very offensive, and therefore he was chased by the Sudarshan Chakra. But for Ambarish, no, I never thought that you made any offense. So we have to be very careful when you're serving Vaishnavas. You have to be very much aware of what you're doing at all times, because it's very easy to make offenses, and they may not react to it, but that doesn't mean that you don't get a reaction yourself. So I had that practical experience with Srila Prabhupada. That you really have to be conscious of what you're doing at every moment. And if you get to a point where that familiarity comes in and you start making mistakes, then the better thing is to back off, which I did. All right? Okay, it's 10 to 3. I have my lunch is waiting for me. If I don't get there by 3 o'clock, there'll be no lunch. So I'm afraid I have to exercise the other function of my tongue. And now I've been talking, now I'm going to go and taste. So thank you all very much. Srila Prabhupada ki jai.